come and get wrecked by the best. Fuck silence!
The Disciples audio animation by Stereo Stages.
I was about 5 or 6 the first time I saw Nightface. We had just moved from New York to a small town in Georgia. At the end of Cherry Lane sat an old 1800s Victorian home. 3 stories, a large basement, and a sizable unkempt yard. I had never seen the house until we drove up to it in the moving truck. A horrible feeling of dread and anxiety washed over me. I hated that house from the second I saw it. My mom told me. I knew I didn't want to see my room or any inch of that house, but a stern look from my dad told me I didn't have much of a choice. Huge and old, the house made so many noises at night, it was always hard for me to sleep with the creaking and banging in the walls. The first night in that house, I woke up to a loud bang on the wall right next to my headboard. It startled me awake from a dead sleep, but I couldn't move. It felt as if there were a terrible weight on my chest. Heart pounding, I couldn't even breathe and began to cry hysterically. Several books and objects on my shelf fell off, making a racket in the otherwise silent house. Some sort of a dark mass that overshadowed the already dark room made itself known to me in the corner. It looked like the growing shadow of a large man and continued toward the ceiling like a giant standing up. Still unpacking and getting situated, my mother must have heard my sobbing, or maybe the things falling from my shelf, because her footsteps headed towards my room. The old door slowly creaked open, and light from the hall filtered in, backlighting my mother's angelic face as the shadows receded back into normalcy.
Honey, are you okay?
She asked. The weight had left my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I just looked at her with pleading eyes. She told me she knew it was stressful because her and my dad were stressed too, but that everything was going to be okay. She came in, kissed me on the forehead, and went back to what she was doing. The light from the hallway and shuffling around for my parents brought me great comfort, and eventually I fell back asleep. Morning came, and everything felt brighter. The worries from last night seemed distant, like having a nightmare that you forgot about. That was, until I got to school that day. Everybody kept looking at me weird. I thought it was just because I was the new kid in a small town. Then Johnny asked me,
You're living in that old scary house, right?
I just looked at him, too anxious to respond.
My dad says kids go missing in that house, and that I should never, ever go there.
The rest of the school day passed by in a daze. My mind was racing, trying to put everything together and keep calm. What the hell was Johnny talking about? Kids go missing. The look seemed like people were taking pity on me. I overheard hushed conversations from other kids.
How long do you think he will last? Shh. That's him? Poor kid.
Even my teacher seemed taken aback when I told her my name and that I just moved here into the old house on the end of Cherry Lane. Things seemed to get even more tense when I got home. Other people had confirmed what I already knew about this place. Something was entirely off. As it got later and I was in bed, the day and the previous night's events kept running through my mind. Perhaps it was just a child's overactive imagination, but every shadow and dark area seemed to take shape, moving around in my peripheral vision. For the next few weeks, these dancing shadows plagued me at night, making it hard for me to sleep and leaving me almost always anxious. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, unable to move, that heavy feeling on my chest again. Low, inhuman breathing sounded from the corner in my room. As it increased in a starving ferocity, the weight on my chest became more intense. It felt as if my lungs might collapse under the overbearing pressure. 2 animalistic, luminescent eyes slowly opened, dead and milky white. They stared into me, unblinking. Under its gaze, the blood in my veins ran cold as ice. I hadn't known true fear until that night. The thing stretched out at me like how a shadow moves in shifting light. Its spindly pointed fingers slid along the floor, crawling up the foot of my bed. two-dimensional, like a sheet of black paper. As a long, jagged hand slowly crept up the blanket towards my face, his form grew, stretching across the ceiling and growing to fill the room, changing from a flat, two-dimensional shadow into a fully realized form. Nightface slowly sunk from the ceiling towards me. His face was right above mine. The rest of his shadowy frame slowly twisted and mixed into a solid shape with jittering, unnatural movements. Hot, steaming breath washed over me, smelling of toxic chemicals. A mouth opened in his dark face, revealing multiple rows of jagged, crooked, sharp teeth. A low, unearthly chuckle reverberated from the entity as his dead, glowing eyes remained locked on mine. He leaned in closer, bringing his face mere inches from mine, his mouth opening so wide it took up all of his face except for those haunting, luminous eyes. A pale light seemed to emanate from deep within its open maw, but the light wasn't going out. It was going in. I felt weak and helpless. Cold spread from the inside of my body as a guttural hiss came from his open, toothy mouth. It became harder and harder to breathe. My vision started getting darker, while his dull, luminous eyes glowed with more intensity. Unable to move, my body convulsed, tears pouring from my eyes. The time must have turned to 12 a.m. because the old cuckoo clock on the wall began to chime as the gears turned and the wooden bird chirped, shattering the horrible silence. The creature's face shifted violently to face the noise without moving his head. With his eye contact broken, I felt reinserted in my own body, and the terror held in was released all at once. An ear-splitting scream filled my room and escaped down the hallway before I even realized I was making the sound, snapping his attention back at me. The calm, sadistic look the monster had before was gone. Now above me was the epitome of darkness and enmity, true despair. His shade-like body shuddered and trembled in a demonic rage. A cold, clawed hand gripped the front of my shirt, raking along the skin of my chest. He pulled me towards his open mouth, jaws unhinging even wider. The rows of teeth seemed to dance in his mouth for the chance to tear into my flesh. Nightface towered over me, hunched just to fit inside the room, and moved his open mouth down, preparing to shove my whole body into his bladed maw. The door burst open and my father hit the light switch in a confused panic, asking,
"What is it? What's wrong?"
As the light filled the room, Nightface disappeared with the dark. His after-image burnt into my blinking eyes while they struggled to adjust to the light, leaving behind only the faintest trace of a disappearing dark wisp to hint any of it was real. My body had fallen backwards onto the bed, released from his grasp in midair, crying and hysterical. I couldn't even form words as my father checked me over and stared in bewilderment at the shallow, bleeding claw marks across my chest. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I went into a sort of catatonic state. What I do remember is waking up in the hospital. The fluorescent lighting made me feel safe. Many people came to talk to me over the few days I spent there under observation. A social worker and police officer questioned me about my home life, how my parents were when no one else was around. I knew this was serious, so I lied. Not about my parents. I lied about Nightface. I told them I had a nightmare and I scratched myself while falling out of bed and hit my head. There wasn't much they could do after I stuck to my story. So a few days under observation and I got to go back home. Back to that house. I begged and pleaded for my parents to let me sleep in their room that night. They could tell I was clearly traumatized and terrified about something, but didn't understand what it was. Hell, I didn't even understand what it was. I still don't. I was perhaps the only kid who knew that monsters were real, that there is a reason to be scared of the dark. They let me sleep in their room for the next week or two, but eventually my father had enough.
"Son, it's time to be a big boy. You can't hide from the things you're afraid of forever."
And that was that. No amount of pleading or bargaining would change his mind after it had been made. I dreaded the night, for I knew what dwelled within it. Every time the sun started to go down, that sinking feeling in my stomach spread like poison through my veins. Although I had been banished from the safety of my parents' bedroom, they at least had gotten me a nightlight. I set it up next to my bed, and the yellow rocket ship covered me in a cone of protective light. It wasn't another 6 months until I saw Nightface again. I was 7 now, and although I hadn't stopped using the nightlight, I had grown more comfortable in our new house and was sleeping a bit more through the nights. This night, however, I turned over to see 2 white, dull glowing eyes staring at me from outside the window. Quickly, I threw the covers over my head to hide from the monster I always knew would return. Peeking out confirmed that there he stood, unblinking and unmoving as the steam from his breath fogged and receded on the window over and over. I don't know what was worse, looking out from under the covers to see him fixated on me, or not seeing him when I pulled the blankets back over my head. He returned the next night, and the next. I couldn't sleep with him watching me. I knew he wanted to devour me, waiting patiently for his chance outside the thin window. As long as I had the light, he couldn't get me. But that was about as comforting as sleeping in a shark cage. I began to fall asleep at school due to staying awake every night. After the 3rd day in a row of falling asleep in Miss Graham's class, she called my mother and sent me home. On the ride home, my mom didn't look mad, more worried and maybe a little sad. With tears rolling down my face, I told her about Nightface, how he wouldn't leave me alone, how he wanted to kill me. Now she looked angry.
What do you think your father would say if he finds out about this?
I sniffled and stared at my shoes, feeling like an absolute disappointment. When we got home, she told me to finish my chores and to stop with the nonsense, or she'd be forced to tell my father. It wasn't as if he abused me, but he was an old school, no-nonsense type of guy. I finished all my chores and waited in my room for supper as instructed. Before long, my eyes became heavy. It had been days since I slept for more than a few moments. I awoke to pitch black. Outside, a storm raged, and heavy rainfall beat against my window. My heart dropped at the realization that nightfall had come, and that I wasn't prepared. Immediately, my body turned to face the window where normally 2 hungry eyes fixated on me. Pulse-pounding terror filled me. He wasn't there, which meant he was somewhere else. Scrambling to the other side of the bed, I searched for the switch to my nightlight and froze. From under my bed, a thick wall of darkness rose to the ceiling and stretched out, encompassing the room entirely. 2 white, luminous eyes slowly opened in the giant form, followed by a gleaming, toothy mouth. Its salivated, dissipating shadow as jaws the size of a great white shark opened wide, revealing more teeth protruding in every direction than I could count. Frozen in horror, or perhaps under its power, I could do nothing but stare, wide-eyed and unblinking. The air stung my eyes as tears streamed down my face. The creature swelled over me. Continuing to grow in size, his presence became stronger as well, more oppressing, more final. With hate etched into the monster's dark face, he moved closer, savoring my fear. His 2 elongated arms rested on the footboard and headboard, dwarfing my bed. Undulating, his body brought the eyes slowly toward me in a perverse, mechanical fashion. Huge, abysmal jaws hung over me like an umbrella, sliding out to envelop me. I looked into its throat, into hell, where the light of life powered this darkness. I could feel the pain and terror of others like me, others who Nightface had taken. Just as I was about to be consumed, body and soul, an ear-shattering crack broke the heavens. Only half a second passed before a blinding flash erupted through the window. Nothing less than divine intervention could describe the lightning's light that tore through Nightface and left him dispelled into a rising black smoke and angry hiss. Whatever held me frozen in place broke, and I went sprawling into the floor, fumbling for the switch of my nightlight. The yellow rocket ship's amber light bathed me in a protective glow. Part of me knew that it would be a while before Nightface came back. I think he needed time to reform after being damaged by light. But the rest of me didn't give a shit. I'd never spend another night in the dark as long as I live. After that night, something seemed to change in our new house, for the better. There was an indescribable feeling of panic and dread that seemed to lift from the old place. Although I still slept with a nightlight and other contingencies I'd came up with to help me feel safe, I did actually sleep. My grades went up, everyone said I had a wonderful attitude and was a pleasure to be around. Despite my completely rational fear of the dark, my life improved in almost every way. Years passed, and I really grew to love that old house. There was a certain charm and care put into buildings before people had power tools. I was heading into junior high school at the top of my class, and things really couldn't have been much better. All of that stuff with Nightface, or the Night Terrors, as my therapist had called them, was over. Or so I thought. That night when I was 7 was not the last time I saw Nightface.
Oh shit! That's my cousin, Nightface. Yeah, we go way back. Palling around and just kicking it, getting into antics and shenanigans and things of that nature. Oh, good times. Good fucking times, bro. Alright, well, let's get on with the getting on. Not in a weird way. Enjoy your holidays! Merry Christmas, Kwanzaa. Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa. That's like most of them in one. Yeah, sick, dude. Fucking sick. So, celebrate it. Be careful. There's a big fucking freaky guy that comes down people's chimneys, and I'm pretty sure he's up to no good. Okay? I'm pretty fucking sure. I bet some money on it. Well, hope you like the video. I wrote it, produced it, just for you. So like, subscribe, share, do it all. Do it all for me, your bro, the disciple, your bro. Alright? Cool. So, enjoy your holidays, like the video, share it, and I will see you later. Got some more videos coming out. Peace out, Girl Scout.
What do you think your father will think if he finds out about this? I pause. Shut up, don't fucking laugh about me. Whip your little ass, bitch.